We've had one request already to stick to the structure, and we're actually ahead of time by a few minutes. So this is about Arctic social science and Arctic policy, and the first question is, A, what responsibilities should Arctic social scientists have looking forward to policymakers and the public? Pretty open-ended. I would be happy to have anyone start. Do we have any responsibilities? No responsibilities? Do we need to be involved with helping to make policy, or should we be independent? Any ideas? Let's wait, remember to wait until you get the mic.
I have a different perspective on that than most people. I think we need to start from the two realizations. One is that governments, all governments involved in the Arctic, have done absolutely nothing over the past 300 years to help people. In fact, their policies have been to actively harm Native people. And one of our major interventions in policy has got to be stop doing so much harm, rather than, oh, you can do this good thing or that good thing or the other thing is, I am really in some fundamental ways upset by our focus on climate change, because that's half the problem that Native people face. The other half is nothing changes. The houses are still full of mold. The kids are still sick and with skin diseases. The women are still being beaten, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that our entire focus on change has missed the problem that Native people face, that nothing changes simultaneously, along with change. I mean, there's the problem of change and the problem of no change. So I think our interventions in policy need to focus much more on stopping the harm that governments do, rather than pretending, oh, if you only do this or if you only do that, everything will be better.
Anna.
Yeah, Gerald? Oh, sorry. Gerald, thank you for that. How would you tell a room full of people who are primarily academic, scientific researchers, how do you think they should approach that issue? What would you want your colleagues here to know about how they can be effective in making those changes, which I don't think anybody would disagree with you about are critical?
I think it starts, I don't need a microphone unless you want me to. I think it starts from realizing that our major research questions have been the questions that interest states and corporations, governments. You know, oh, what can we do about climate change? Well, we do very little research on issues such as, how do women who are being beaten support each other? How do they, when you talk about traditional ecological knowledge, forgive me, it's such bullshit. Because the ecology that people up there worry about is, how do you deal with each other when one of your kids commits suicide? How do you, we've got to, I think, to be more helpful. We've got to put aside the questions that governments are interested in and develop a set of questions that matter to the vulnerable people up north. And that's going to be very hard, because they don't want, they're not going to, NSF is funded because it addresses questions that, that are of interest to states and corporations.
Mm-hmm. Amanda?
So, I mean, I don't disagree with you, but I do have to say we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And climate change is going to make everything worse. And so we need to understand that, for example, a major cause of domestic violence is associated with joblessness and poverty. If we don't address the impacts of climate change, then joblessness and poverty are going to get worse. Now, it is true that many of the actions that need to be taken associated with climate change are actions that are going to be taken outside the Arctic. But I think that we do have a responsibility, thinking about this question, I think we do have a responsibility as Arctic scientists to point out exactly this, that we have the long-term impacts of colonisation in the Arctic exacerbated by environmental damage, exacerbated by heavy metal pollution, exacerbated by climate change, and that we have a responsibility to say that, you know, these are questions that are urgent. And we're not talking about things that might happen in 20 years or 50 years or 100 years. We're talking about challenges that are being faced by communities now because of the confluence of all of these forces. And so I think that, you know, we don't need to argue about we're going to focus on this or that, but just understand that every issue that we deal with, if we think about things in terms of a problem orientation as opposed to a discipline orientation, is going to have multiple proximate and ultimate causes, and we need to be able to address all of those in a meaningful way. That is an enormous challenge to scholarship, I think. But it's an enormous challenge to our society as a whole as well.
Thank you very much. Yes, Jessica?
Well, it's kind of early, so it's hard for me to be coherent right now. But just picking up on this a little, idea about, you know, relevant research and for whom. Part of this goes to discussions that we were having earlier about, and even Lena was talking about yesterday, about the, you know, communities themselves being able to ask for money and create projects themselves and do research in and of themselves. But if we kind of connect that also to this discussion about whether or not we have a responsibility and to policy, so in that sense, I don't know if we've been aiming for money that just speaks to what the government is interested, but if you kind of flip that around and say, well, these are questions that are coming from the communities, and these are really important to communities, and in a sense, we do as social scientists do have an obligation or responsibility if we are engaged in those projects to try to affect policy, because we should be trying to help change policies that would rectify the problems that exist. And so in that sense, I think our research does have and should have, or be thinking, you know, there is a policy element always to this, because we are trying to better society in some way. We have to deal with the fact that a lot of these things are dealt with in a regulatory, in a regulated, manner, and whether it's local regulations or federal, but policies are needed to be addressed.
And I think that's an important point, Jessica, that when we talk about policy, we can be talking about community policy, local policy, regional policy, transnational policy, and I don't think we have people here from all over the circumpolar region. I want to make sure that we don't focus too much on just American policy, just Alaskan policy. We've got to think about the ways in which this affects a larger audience. So I think I saw Karen's hand first.
I mean, just to add quickly to this conversation, which I think is important, it might be useful for us to differentiate among different ways of affecting policy, and I think there is still a space for a certain sort of, for lack of a better word, but critical social science research that really questions the underpinnings of what policy is for and what it means to sort of support certain sort of state interventions or different, whether it's resource development schemes or managerial, ways of, configuring populations. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of scholarship on this, and I think it's important to, to recognize that we can contribute to better understanding that, and that there may be policy implications for that in a way. And I think there's a variety of different ways that we as individual scholars can choose to really elaborate those implications. I don't know if all of us have to be sort of formulating the nuts and bolts of different regulatory apparatuses. So I guess it seems like there might be a broader landscape of figuring out how we might work to engage in policy in some way, even if that's in a sort of at a remove and in somewhat of more of a critical vein.
Yes, John.
Hi, I am curious what this audience, what this group of researchers think of when they say policy makers. It seems like you're throwing something over the fence into a big box, and I'm wondering if you had to identify a parliamentarian or a congressperson or people in the executive branch who you would designate as a key Arctic policymaker, do you even know who these people are? And if you then know them, then you know something about how they do their work, how they spend their day, what influences they come into contact with. I'd be very curious about that, because right now it just sounds like you're chucking something into a big box far away called policymakers.
Excellent. Well, anyone want to pick that one up? Okay.
So, no? Yeah. So I think that I mentioned this briefly in another group, and again, my home discipline is political science, but I think one of the things that we have a responsibility to do, those of us at least who do research that is problem-based, is to help make this connection between the kinds of research or science that we produce and the real way, as John points out, that political systems actually work. Because political systems, you can't just give them more science, or you can't just give them better science. That's not how decisions are made, right? They take all that in, their staffers give it all to them. But in all of our Western, all of our democracies, and this is on tape.
Yeah.
Okay. All,
Remember that.
But the point is that we have to understand, as John is pointing out, right, that the actual politics, when it goes into those legislative and executive mechanisms, is based, very much with constituent interests, right, with interests that policy makers, at least in the political sphere, have that may be quite different from the science priorities that even are agreed upon by policymakers who might be in agencies or in other institutions. So all I'm saying is that we have an ability with our education and our research to help make connections between people who may want change or want to better understand change or better use the different kinds of information we produce in the political realm to help them understand how that political realm functions. And the only other thing I would say would be to reify this point that policymakers, right, can also be very much these local scale places. So you can start at your county or your borough. I mean, I know it's different between the federal countries and the unitary countries, but I think that's just an important thing to remember, that we can help in terms of providing information at a local scale, because I'll just end with, I think it's tricky for us and it's dangerous for us to prescribe policy based on our research. But the goal, at least in my research, or what I think is an ethical norm, is that we should be leaving complete, digestible, understandable products that then the people we work with can decide themselves what they're going to do with it. And then part of that decision is hopefully that we've left an understanding of how they can use that to make change if they choose to, and they may not. So that's where we also have to sort of leave our babies, right? Leave this research and say, here's where it can be used. But it's not, in some ways, I would say, our role to prescribe policy, unless, of course, we're an Arctic resident in a location where we want to, make that change ourselves.
Let's have Nora, and then we'll have Anna.
So, as we all know, the U.S. is the chair of the Arctic Council right now, and I've been in Washington the last while working, representing the Smithsonian on a number of different interagency groups. And one of the things that has interested me is that we have I think there's a lot of there have been a lot of forums and discussions about the Arctic, and there's a very visible role for natural science in all of those forums, and a less visible role for social science. So you don't see nearly as many social scientists giving talks and presentations about their work in DC. And on the flip side, within the agencies, there are a lot of natural scientists that are employed that are working in the Arctic, and there are fewer social scientists, but there are some social scientists that are employed. And so I think one of the questions that I have is, how do we get from producing work that has something to say to policymakers, something that would be of interest to policymakers, because I think a lot of us do, to, actually having those products or messages, or just directly having platforms to share our results more visibly within spheres where policymakers are listening, because I think there is still a pretty big gap right now.
Anna, I think I saw your hand next.
Oh, yeah, my question was, I came up with a generation of scholars that had a lot of negative results from applied sort of intervention research. And so we were really pushed away from that back to sort of very basic scientific principles and the do no harm. And so my question is, does anybody in this room have a really good example of how their research was utilized by local communities in affecting change?
This is sort of not the kind of, I think one of the other sort of black boxes of policy is we're sort of thinking very big level policy. But I can definitely say, within the context of the archaeological work we do in Iceland, which is mostly heritage oriented, the immediate sort of policy outcome is that there's a bunch of things where the research that's been driven there, not necessarily by me or my team, but just collectively, has seen things like push into historical archaeology as relevant as important heritage, which has now been realized on the regulatory framework just over the last 10 years. People who brought that interest have pushed that sort of up to that level. So change in what is heritage itself. There's been a heavy new emphasis on the sort of heritage management level of non-intrusive geophysics and remote sensing as a critical tool for the management of heritage, which has come again from research-driven projects that have pushed those methods, put them into the sort of community of what's going on, and that's gone into the sort of the regulatory framework. And even locally, the idea of working with museums who have used sort of archaeological projects in local areas to develop awareness among people within the community, to set a priority for landscape management and heritage within that, have taken it on as educational programs among like middle schoolers, things like that. All of those are things that were driven sort of by that local interaction, either on the state level or within local communities. And in many ways just came out of collaborative relationships that weren't actually, the research wasn't designed to affect that policy. It just sat in a relationship with people who were interested in utilizing it in ways, and that collaboration had that come out of it.
I'll just follow up on that briefly too, working in the same area and also working in the museum field, that as a result of those kinds of community-based heritage policies, thinking about archaeology, it's also led to a recognition that the more work that gets done, the more collections are built up, the more that we are straining the resources of the countries in which we are standing. So funding from NSF, funding from other places is making an impact, but there's also at times a negative impact or an unexpected impact of the work that we do in the communities outside that are straining their resources because we cannot provide perpetual support. And so we see in those cases, on the one hand, the sites and the larger complexes and concepts are becoming valued and curated. But the questions about how much can actually be kept in the museums is straining the local thing. So I want to, at some point, Anna, I want to sort of follow up on the question you had, which is in addition to where have we seen our actions and our research lead to good outcomes in there, but where have we seen ours or our peers' work lead to unintended negative consequences at the local level because we are or are not following through or think that we're working towards one policy that may be different from that of the communities we're in or is leading to unintended ways. We can come back to that. I think there was another question. Gerald, you probably have a lot to say, and that's good.
Just a bit, then I'll try
Yeah,
to shut up.
good. No, that's great.
I worry about the whole notion of policy. I'm thinking about your issue of the policymakers as a black box. I think we need to keep in mind that nowadays there are two sets of policymakers, one in the dominant society and one in the native communities, where the elite, we used to call the tribal council, they are making policies too. And in both cases, the policies that are being made have very little to do with the well-being of the ordinary people in the community. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I want to urge us to consider, in addition to, and this follows up from Anna's point about the old days of the horrible applied anthropology, I want us to consider that our task is to get involved not simply in policy, because policy is a word that plays into the hands and the laps of the elite. We need to focus on practice. And practice is a different concept, because practice has to do with, for example, how do people console each other after a suicide? Policy has to do with how do the elites cooperate with corporations and governments and stuff like that, which in some sense is none of our damn business.
I feel like I drove this whole thing about the policy. And like that we should be making policy recommendations, I guess. And coming back a little bit, I mean, if we are academics, and so if our questions are problem based, because we see something, we see a problem, and we're interested in it, and if we are doing what it seems like we're tasked to do for Arctic social scientists, and we are working in communities, we're supposed to be looking at a problem that's not something that we created in our own head, me living outside in Toronto, but something that's been a co-production of an idea that has started within the community itself. And so, and you're trying to solve a problem. And I guess because I do international relations and I look at governance and that goes into hard law, soft law, all these kind of things, one way to solve that problem normally has to do with engaging with rules, laws, regulations at some level. And so that's all I'm saying about this. And I just want to say one more thing. I don't think we need to be talking about either or. I really feel, and maybe this goes to this one question later about guided by national policy goals or independent from there. I don't understand why there can't be a role actually for basic research, which is so fundamental to everything that we do, but also perhaps make a space for the ability to do applied research.
And we definitely, I think we will absolutely get into those in B and C, not that we shouldn't address them now, but let's,
But,
you know.
and so, okay,
Yeah,
yeah, I'm just
great,
saying,
great.
so instead of trying to, I
Thanks.
feel like we're gonna go either or.
So much Siri, and then Igor.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to make a quick comment about those unintended consequences of our
Yeah.
research as well. For policy, that a lot of the vulnerability research, vulnerability to climate change that has come out of the Arctic has had an influence around the world as well. That there's been a great deal of focus on what are the sort of indicators of vulnerability, things to do with unemployment and ill health, issues that we can argue are actually symptoms more of colonization than really of a sort of vulnerability. And so the work that I've done, not so much in the Arctic, but in Australia, is in seeing, what does it do when we start focusing only on those indicators of vulnerability, and what are we ignoring when we do that? And a question there is how can we focus away from indicators themselves and ask questions that are more problem-oriented for these communities, to say, what are the problems that we're facing and what are the strengths that we have to address them and resolve them? In particular, in handling climate-related hazards. So again, this is not quite relevant for the Arctic, but in northern Australia, where there's hurricanes and so on that are problematic, working with communities to find how do their institutions, how do their knowledge systems deal with these kinds of hazards, and how can we build on those knowledge systems in resolving them as well. And one of the policy relevant outcomes of that in Australia has been a rethinking of some of the emergency management practices there. So there are ways that we can at least be ethically conscious of what the kinds of research that we do, how that's picked up by policy. Yeah, I'll stop there. But.
So at some level, there's a discussion going on here between focusing on symptoms and looking for causes, as well as the integration between those two things. Is that a way to put this up here, just to, yeah, so causes versus symptoms, thanks. Yes, Igor?
Okay, I feel that we are trapped here in a sentence full of buzzwords. John did a very good job to deconstruct one, policymakers. And I would like to deconstruct another one, which is responsibilities. I don't think we have any responsibilities to policymakers, or at least I don't want to participate in the discussion on what are our responsibilities to policymakers, because we don't have responsibilities. You know, we have responsibility to produce solid data, to do good science, but I don't think we signed for any responsibilities for policymakers as, let's say, university scientists. Even for people who work for the government, and I'm partly in that class, we don't have responsibility to the government. And so if we just eliminate this word or replace it with something which is closer to what we are doing, and again, responsibility to the public. That's another kind of a buzzword, a buzz combination that we use that leads us nowhere, because our responsibility is to communities who host us or cooperate with us. There's responsibility to our institutions who fund our research, but the public does not fund our research except, you know, through taxpayers' money. So I just, yeah, okay, but it's not directly. I mean, yeah, responsibility to taxpayers is again another buzzword combination that is very hard to operate with. So my push is for us to use a vocabulary that we are comfortable with, rather than the vocabulary we are not comfortable with.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Igor. I think the most important part of that sentence to me is the question mark at the end. And in part, it's the question is raised by the fact that at least one, if not more of us in this audience, and people that we know, have had personal or institutional attacks from people in Congress. And we know that funding is debated heavily about NSF or others, considering whether, in fact, funding should be going only to the United States, to projects in the United States, the things that focus on policies that people in government, and that's not just here, that's in other parts of the world. We know that in many parts of the EU and others, it's more common to see calls for proposals that are focused on a specific set of agenda points, which NSF's Arctic Social Science has not been so focused on. So I agree with you, and that's where I hope the debate goes, and the semantics of the words is really good. The question mark's important, and Anna has a question.
I was going to say, Igor brought it up, but I would say I am certainly accountable. I may not be responsible, but I am certainly accountable to the American taxpayer, and we are all very aware of that and reminded of that, and that's part of how our system works. So we may not be responsible to them, but we are certainly accountable to them for how we spend their money.
Yeah, Chris Wolf here.
I'd just like to say I agree and disagree with some of what Igor said, which is not uncommon. I agree that we don't really have responsibilities to policymakers themselves, whoever they are. And I also agree, but I do agree that we need to, our responsibility is to create good data. I think the responsibility that I see that's important is to make that data accessible and available to various publics, the public that we interact with directly in our work, but also to a broader public in a way that they can understand what we do, that's jargon-free. I think in that way, what we do with that responsibility is make it into something that policymakers, whoever they are, can also, you know, engage the public. Or they're a part, and these people are not separate from the public either. They're not some people that are sort of overarching nemesis. It's a part of the public, and they recognize these things as they enter into the public sphere. And I think that's where we often fail in our responsibility, because it's often not something that's highly regarded in our institutions when we do this more public-facing these types of work. But I think that responsibility is very important for us to make these things open and accessible, and to create an awareness, at least, of some of the issues in our research and ways that policymakers maybe can then interface with.
We're going to, because people asked me to hold us to strict time limits, we're going to start switching over in a minute, but I just wanted to say that is a really important point to me. I mean, when I look around here, I've read papers that most of you have written, and I've written them myself. And when I hear us describe in common language here what we're doing and compare it to the jargon-rich papers that we present, that we are writing probably for the imagined audience of 5 others of our peers or our tenure committees or others, the disjunction between the two of them is really, we can talk here in ways that we are talking here in ways that anyone in the public or anyone in policy levels could understand. Most of our work never gets to that level, and that's an interesting thing. I'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll move on. Susan.
So I think, as someone who lives sort of half my life as in the research world, but also directing a museum, first of all, in terms of a response to Anna, for years I've done archaeological research in Labrador that was motivated by questions of the academy, and certainly I was interacting with the community on some other non-archaeological levels in terms of collections that our museum has that are very relevant to that community. But after years of what we might call basic or pure research, the community then came to me and said, you have a sense of our past and our heritage, which is a perspective different than the one we have, and we would like to sit with you and talk about it because of initiatives about identity that the community was undertaking. And so since then, suddenly my archaeological work, which started out as pure research, has in fact become very, very relevant to the community. So from that perspective, I would caution us that really that pure research, basic research, is absolutely essential that we continue to do. The other is that as a museum that interacts with the public, Jenny and I invite a lot of academics to give public presentations, and a lot of our colleagues do it, and they are invaluable, actually very fun, easy things to do. I mean, you're getting to talk to people about your work. I mean, how often do you get to do that? To a rapt audience, but also we're teachers. And I think one of the things that we have not discussed here is that many of us are in academic institutions, and we have classrooms full of students. And the mentoring and the impact, we bring our research to the classrooms, and we should not forget that component either. And so I think that identity as professors and teachers to undergraduates and graduate students, but to the general public, is essential one that we should not forget.
Was there one more, I think? Yeah, Jessica.
Yeah, just one last question to follow up on Christopher, because I really appreciated what you said about the basic research, and then that we've kind of failed in a way to put it into digestible form to different publics. And I'm just curious, and it's often because we don't have the opportunity, this is not something that's often supported maybe. I'm just wondering if there's a way, if there's any place in NSF to help support to take the basic research that's funded and the results that we have, and to help support us as researchers to transform that knowledge into, and that information into something that's, I mean, I know we're supposed to, at the end of everything, have this, what's our output in our, in our outreach and these type of things, but at the end of the day, we're supposed to be producing it for academic journals, and I would love to have to have more support to be able to actually turn it into digestible information that could be readily given to many different types of publics, and so, I don't know.
Go ahead, Anna.
No, but Anna, because you funded me to do that. So I just want to say that my work would be an example of where in the actual research proposal, we wrote that we would create a full report that was digestible. In other words, we included in our application the fact that prior to any academic publication, the research team would produce and return everything down to photographic records of all the thought processes, gone through on butcher paper in these workshops, all back to the community. So in that sense, we have an extra year, essentially, of funding for graduate students and myself and others to produce that report along with. So I don't know if maybe others just haven't thought through that you can ask for that, but at least we asked for it and we're lucky enough to get it. So it's doable, but it does mean that if you're not a person who thinks very well about how to communicate at those different levels, you do for sure want to have a team or other people with you who do, because it is a technique, right? It is a learned process if you're used to only being more of an isolated academic. I'll just stop because other people want to say.
I think Anna probably
Yeah,
wants to say
thanks,
some things
Amy.
about.
That answers the question. Yes, you can. But I wanted to just give an example. At the workshop in Fairbanks, there was a young Tlingit, early career, I should say. We shouldn't put age on people. Early career Tlingit scholar who had written his dissertation and works for First Alaskans, Kyle Work, and he was marvelous. And we were talking about this very subject. How do you return your... And he said, I realized after writing my dissertation, getting my PhD, that if I were truly going to return my work to the Tlingit people, and he himself is Tlingit, he said, I needed to write some speeches, and I needed to create a dance, and write some songs. And he said, that's a lot of work. And I was thinking about that, and I thought, wow, that's like amazing. And Kyle, had he written me a dissertation improvement grant, and had I been recognizing the culturally appropriate, which is something we should all think about, not just what's understandable to the public, but what's culturally appropriate way in which to return this. And of course, I'm not Tlingit, so I wasn't thinking about this being a culturally appropriate way for him to I'll fund you, Kyle, to do that, to write those speeches, to make that dance, to write those songs, and to return your work to your community in a culturally appropriate way. I love the thought of that. And hopefully Kyle at some point will get around to doing that, because he feels very dedicated towards that. The other thing I want to, as we're talking about, and I don't want to give a speech, but I did want to, we're all social scientists here. We all realize that our basic research is socially constructed within this milieu, that nobody here doesn't recognize that that's true. So we're placing layers, and I'm not advocating nihilism, that you can't understand anything because everything is socially constructed. I'm not Clifford Geertz. I'm not Geertz, but Clifford and Marcus. I'm not into postmodernism. But what I do want to point out as a sideline, I don't know if any of you have read Beth Marino's work on climate change in the North. And she makes it's a marvelous piece of work. Can't remember, what is it called? Severe Climate... Yeah, do you remember the title of the book? Anyway, Beth Marino, I'll find it online. You can find it online. She does a marvelous job of showing how hazards are socially constructed. The reason Shishmarith, the reason Kivalina, all of these things, the reason these communities are in trouble is because of their long history of colonialism and being set in a certain place and the change that they've undergone. It doesn't mean that the drivers aren't natural drivers, but there are also huge social drivers in that process. There are, anyway, you should all read that book. I highly recommend it. Sacred Ground, that's it, Severe Climate Sacred Ground. It's a marvelous piece of work. It's very accessible, and she makes a very clear point, and now I'm preaching about how these natural processes that are being experienced by communities are actually socially constructed, and we're not studying that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think as well in terms of the social construction of knowledge, and you brought up, Anna, the issue of the early career scholars, others, people at different points in their careers, as well as people who are some in museums, some in the academy in different ways. The idea that broader impacts can only be peer-reviewed journal articles, I think, is specifically an important issue for people who are early career scholars who they are not going to get through tenure for having as many of these publicly accessible things. That's an institutional change that we need to hope we'll see. I cannot imagine it in a world where we're now looking at journal scores to see advancement. But that creates a very strange situation in which those of us who have reached a certain point or gone into an alternate career track may have more opportunities through museums and others to talk to the public than those who are at the cutting edge at an early stage. And I find that to be a really problematic issue. I have no solutions to it, but
Research teams, that's one of the
research teams are terribly
Because then
important.
you can have people who have that freedom working with younger people who maybe
Sure,
need to be first name
sure.
on publication.
Let me just say, I'm not going to stop the conversation and say, let's change to something else, but just so that we know we are into kind of the realm of the second question, which does really overlap, and that is just, should our work be guided by efforts to promote better policy development at local, national, and international levels to help confront and direct social, environmental, political, strategic goals? I point that out just because someone said to me, let's make sure we hit each of these points.
Someone is me, right?
I think it's you. Well, no, I'm not naming names. I think there were 2 or 3 people who said that. And we don't have to shift entirely because we are moving back and forth between these, but I just want to say where we are. And we've got 20 minutes until there will be coffee. So George needs a microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, this applies to both the question we were just talking about and
Exceptional.
One just example from archaeology that I wanted to throw out there to address the last question, and it segues nicely with what Anna was just talking about, as there was a volume a few years ago put together by Sheets called Surviving Environmental Change, Surviving Sudden Environmental Change, Answers from Archaeology. And they got funding from the NSF to basically make this book cheap, which everyone knows in the academic world is an extraordinary thing. And actually, the book itself is free online if you are from an NGO or you are some sort of a disaster relief manager. One thing they did in this volume is at the end of every chapter, they required the authors to do a one-page digest of their work that was supposed to basically distill a lesson from whatever archaeological event they were talking about that could be useful to people who are facing post-disaster situations. I don't know if they've done any sort of metrics on this publication, but I know the last I heard, it was from University of Colorado Press, and it was one of their best-selling volumes. So at least in that sense, it seems to have gotten some very good coverage. And then to sort of address the question here, to maybe go to policy at the largest level, I think archaeology, in terms of climate change archaeology, and I very much agree with everyone who said climate change is not the only story. Even in our own specific work, we are sort of tacking away from, climate's important, but it's not the whole story. Politics, culture, economics are just as important, blah, blah, blah. But just to talk a little bit about one place that I think we can really influence a very, very important piece of policy through education and through outreach, and that is to really emphasize to the public, and there's a number of examples I have of how we're doing this, the nature of change and landscape change, and the fact that landscapes do change, and the fact that climates do change. And this is just to point out the obvious truth that we have people in our own government who still adhere to a catastrophist view of geology. That basically, again, these guys are on Bishop Usher's side. They do not believe that landscapes are actually changing. These folks, we all know they're out there. I mean, as Kevin said, people we know have been attacked by them. So I think by emphasizing the sort of historical nature of change, we can fight that. And there's a number of ways that it's been done. For instance, in Iceland, a program that we helped develop, but only helped in partnership with Icelanders, called Kids Archaeology, which has then sort of gone viral and has moved across Iceland, where they're basically bringing kids into the field and teaching them methods and talking about landscape change. This is only something that we helped. It was kind of, we were asked for help, we gave it, and now we really have very little to do with it. It's basically moved on its own. A quick, from a colleague of mine in the Park Service, who says they're basically developing a set of narratives for each park, which they're describing as every park has a climate story. So that the park rangers themselves, when people come, and they're not going to, the idea is not to basically do climate change stories, it's just to talk about how things have changed through the past, how a park might have something to do with what we're seeing today. They're trying to make it as apolitical as possible for obvious reasons, but to basically let that story out there, just sink it deep into people's consciousness that yes, things do change, landscapes do change, climates do change. And then there's actually a number of other examples where I think archaeology could be useful towards certain policy ideas. But I think, again, for us, for archaeologists, especially environmental archaeologists, we do have an obligation to try to convince people, or at least throw out the data out there that, yes, climate change does exist. And there's many ways that we can do that.
Yeah. Back here.
I think there were some people before me.
That's okay, you haven't spoken yet, so I wanted to give you a chance, and then we'll move over here.
I kind of want to go back again to the black box that John was referring to with respect to policymakers, and I'm thinking of a conversation that we had in our dinner group with Anna last night about the degree to which we can tell whether or not our research is actually having an impact in the halls of Congress. It's obvious when our research is having an impact in the academic community because we can see who's been citing us, but we don't always know if there are congressional or parliamentary staffers reading our work, and if our work is showing up in any sort of executive summaries as a result of that. We don't have that kind of immediate feedback unless you happen to be plugged into these networks of researchers who are already very much part of the policy conversation. And I also think about the fact that we live in a world now where as academics feel like the onus is increasingly on us to be promoting our own work, for better or for worse, to increase quantitative metrics like the H-index, for example, and get those citations as high up as possible. So I guess the question I'm throwing out here is, what is the best way for us to, we can't force our research on policymakers, obviously, but how can we actually reach out to real people and not just, chuck something over the fence? What's the best way that we can reach out in appropriate and effective ways to get our research, to increase the likelihood that our research will be read by people who will actually do the nitty-gritty policy work? Because I actually don't think that most of us really want to be in the weeds doing policy. We want to be having an impact in policy, but we want to leave the nitty-gritty work to the policymakers.
Yep. Karen, let's get you a microphone so we know what you're saying. That's great, thanks.
I work for the National Park Service, and one of my jobs is translating scientific work into information that's accessible for the public. And there's actually a lot of resources for doing that. There's a TED Talk, there's a series of TED Talks by a guy who wrote a book that's called something like Stop Talking Like a Scientist. And any public communications school in your university will have courses, that will help you to translate your scientific work into information that's easily digestible. But I think, regardless of how we feel about policymakers and our relationship to them, we do have a responsibility to inform them. I mean, where do they get their information from that they're basing their decisions on, if not from us? And so I think we do have a responsibility to translate our academic information into something that's easily acceptable and easily digestible. And how we go about doing that, it could be more of an art than a science, haha. But there's lots of resources out for people. You know, you can sit in on classes, you can look at these TED Talks, there's books that help you. And I think it's part of our responsibility to do that, to make our information accessible.
Karen, that's great. I wanted to just, not to plug our history at the Half and Half for a little bit, but what you're saying is nothing that is new. It just has been lost. When I go back to think about our first director, J. Lewis Giddings, one thing surprised me when he came here from the University of Pennsylvania to be the first anthropologist at Brown. One of the first things he did was take creative writing classes. And his impact on the field is as much and largely and on public consciousness and in Native communities is based on the fact that not only was he a good writer, he knew how to write for the public, he did write for the public, and when he wrote for the public, he made sure that the work that he was doing, whether it was with his students or with his Native collaborators, their words came through clearly in there as opposed to a series of jargon describing them as subjects. And as a result, those works are still used in the communities, and they're things that go back to be thought about. So it's an interesting thing. He didn't make a lot of money out of it. In fact, his big book came out just after he died. But it's an important part of that, and those books have endured for a long period of time, perhaps longer than the journal articles he wrote that were full of jargon about dendrochronology. So, yeah.
Wanted to quickly echo something that Susan mentioned. The other audience we have, right, which is a selective audience, but is our students. And so I think many of us probably in our intro classes, when we have business majors, biology majors, people that are going to go on be, leaders, be voters, if nothing else. And that's a fantastic opportunity to kind of spread our message, right, and talk about the importance of context if you're talking about archaeology or breaking down misconceptions people have. I consciously don't mention Europe or Greece or Rome in my intro to archaeology class at all. I figure they've had it. I'm going to talk about the Great Zimbabwe that they've never heard about, or Cahokia or something that maybe they haven't had a chance to hear about yet. So
yes.
It's a small audience, selective group of the whole general public, but it's a great opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Emily? And then
I think building on that, one of the recurrent themes seems to be audience, and I just want to point out that the general public isn't a specific audience. The general public is made up of a lot of different audiences, and so I think social scientists, among scientists, are pretty good at thinking about the local community or host community side of that audience and building that into the projects from the start in some way that is engaging and reaches out with whatever non-academic products need, like photography or a dance or whatever's required. But then when it comes to translating research for broader audiences, I think we also have to think about who we're translating it for and how it's going to get to them. So, learning how to speak without jargon is one side of that, but it can't just get thrown out onto the internet and we can't assume people are going to see it. So I think that in these kind of public outreach contexts, specifically thinking about more specific audiences, like who are policymakers, who are we trying to reach in that sense, or are you trying to reach adults or high school students, or what channels are you using, are also really important questions. And I don't think any one scientist or any one project can do all of that. I think realistic projects that target specific audiences are pretty important, and I think also that currently we don't necessarily all have a clear idea of who policymakers are and how research can make cross to that divide. And I'd really be interested in hearing a little bit from people who also work outside of university settings on how they see the structures working to reach those audiences.
So we're into questions of scale again, among other things, the scale of different audiences. Anna, you have an idea?
Yeah, I just wanted to say Margaret Mead had a television show, Lest We Forget, which, whether you agree with what she had to say on her television show or not, she did have a television show, which, because of the medium of the time, and she recognized that that was a very powerful tool. If you're really interested, and then I want John Farrell to talk a little bit about the question about how do you reach out to real people. But nothing stops you from taking your work to your local legislator, your local council person. If you think your work is particularly relevant, go and translate it to a staff person. I mean, every American has the right to do that, and there's nothing that stops you from doing that. But since John brought up the black box story, I'd be interested in hearing what John thinks about, should we be focusing our research on priorities, and how does a social scientist reach out? How do you meet those people? What would your recommendation be, John?
Well, here's a dirty little secret. I'm an Arctic policymaker. And I'd be interested to know who actually reads our Arctic policy. I would imagine very few of you have actually looked at our key biennial document that we put out called Arctic Research Commission's Goals and Objectives for Arctic Research. It's a biennial report required by law, and it's on our website. And we try to make it accessible and easily digestible by a broad range of readers. I'm here because I'm trying to become informed about another aspect, more aspects of Arctic research, because we have a broad range for which we are responsible for. And I've greatly appreciated opportunities to work with people like Igor, people like Anna to help inform me, because I am a natural scientist by training. And Igor had a tremendous influence on us in that when I came to the Arctic Research Commission, it was almost entirely focused on natural science. And with Igor's assistance and encouragement of others, we began to include social science goals, such as focus on indigenous languages, cultures, and identities. And so a lot of this was me learning from your communities about how to incorporate these. And if you look at our most recent goals report, you'll see a lot more of these applications to people and social constructs than you would have seen in prior years. So I think there's an evolution towards that. So I think identifying policymakers is a critical thing. I was talking about this with Simon. I said, hey, if we had to jot down the 10 or 20 people in DC that we think of as policymakers, who would they be? There's also people that are policy influencers I would consider. For example, the chair of our commission makes some policy, but that chair also has great influence on people who really do make policy, and that's Fran Ulmer currently. She has the ability and access to speak directly with senators and congresspeople and with people in the highest levels of the administration. She sat next to the president when he had dinner at Alice Rogoff's house up in Alaska. So she's an influencer as well. So I think that's another category of people that, if you so choose to direct your research towards, would have an impact. How do you reach these policymakers?
Could you just speak into the microphone? So it's...
How do you reach these policymakers?
Thank you very much.
You can do it in a lot of ways. If you think, and I'll be DC-centric here because I'm not as experienced in Denmark or Iceland or other places with parliamentarian systems. But you think about what do lobbyists do and who pays lobbyists? They have access. They actually write laws that Congress passes. And these are people who have professional access to policymakers. They know what they're doing. But there's another whole class that was brought up yesterday when Jessica mentioned, what about all these NGOs and think tanks that are influencing policymakers? They're very skilled at this. They're based in DC. They hold lunches. They have receptions. They put out nice little documents that are sponsored by people like Center for Strategic and International Studies, Brookings Institution. There's a whole, the Wilson Center. There's scores of these in DC, World Wildlife Fund. They know that they need to get close to people like Ambassador Dave Bolton or Mark Brzezinski or others. And so they provide social settings for these. They actually go visit them. Some of the things I do, I went to hear a talk by Senator King from Maine, who considers himself an Arctic senator. He's interested in shipping. And he gave a very good talk at Center for Strategic International Studies, and he left the audience with 10 questions. He said, I have these 10 questions about the Arctic. They were good questions. And I thought about it, and I said, we've got answers to about 7 or 8 of those. So I got a couple of colleagues together. I know staffers on the Hill because it takes time to develop those relationships. I called up a staffer working for Senator King and said, hey, we'd like to come by and give you some answers to the questions the senator asked the other day. So Martin Jeffries and I and a guy from the National Petroleum Council, we went up the hill and we sat, and they were very appreciative. You're not going to meet the member, you're not going to work with the congressperson, but you identify their key staff and you give them information directly in response to what they're asking for or need to know. I'm not going to give them an issue of polar geography and say, good luck getting through this 30 pages. They don't have the time for this. These people are extraordinarily busy, and things are coming at them from every direction. And even a best intended plan, suddenly there's a shooting in the district, and all attention is off. All the schedules are cleared for the day, just because of something like that. So that's why I asked the question. You first need to know which of these policymakers you're interested in impacting. Is it Dave Bolton, who's interested in looking at fisheries treaties in the North or in Arctic Council issues? Is it someone in the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management who's setting regulatory frameworks for oil and gas offshore Alaska? Is it someone in the Department of Energy who's interested in microgrids and renewable energy in Alaska? I think it's really critical to think about who these people are and then figure out how they receive information, how they could digest it, how it's relevant to what they do. It takes a lot of work on your side to be able to put yourself in those shoes and think about how they work and what they need. Then it's much easier to craft something. But throwing polar geography over to them, it will go absolutely nowhere. They do not have time. The other thing we do, just for fun, we started this little thing called the Arctic Update. Maybe some of you subscribe to it. We now have 2,700 subscribers. I originally made it just for my commissioners, but it grew in interest. So now I have an ability to stick something in there that I want a few thousand people to see, and very digestible, very easy. That took nothing. It's very simple to do. It's just another example of how, and not a lot of policy makers actually do look at those things because it just takes 30 seconds.
Perfect.
So I hope that helps, Anna.
Thank you. Before we take any other questions, we should be getting ready. There should be some coffee. If one of you two could just check to see if there is coffee back there. I know every army runs on its coffee. 10:15. So the other thing I want to do is I want to decolonize and de-imperialize this conversation just a little bit, because a lot of what we're talking about is really important, and a lot of it sort of extends about 40 miles out from the White House. And we haven't heard anything yet from the people who've come all the way from Iceland, from Finland, from Greenland here. And we send our folks through NSF funding out to other countries. And I think we cannot do that responsibly without knowing a bit more about how policy issues are affected in there. And I don't want to put you on the spot, any of you, but I do want to make sure that we get a sense of how are the things that we do linked into policy, or just how is policy made in your countries? How, for example, what is the role of indigenous communities in driving policy in your countries? And also, to what degree are the ideas and the concepts that we bring in with our money a little bit imperialist or a little bit helpful? And, we could maybe talk about that a little bit after lunch, but I just wanted to say I really don't want us to get too focused only on what happens in the U.S. So no need to jump up on that right away, but please get involved. Is there coffee yet? They're setting up. Okay. In that case, I did see, Igor, you had a hand up here.
John just left the room, and I wanted to return the compliment, but maybe you'll tell him that he is the most pleasant, how he called himself, dirty little policymaker to work with. Because he's a man of curious mind, and he is always open to learn something new. And again, please tell him what I said. But things that he started in this discussion, I believe, led us to some very valuable kind of outcomes. And one is that the landscape of policymakers is really very diverse. And as scientists, we have to know the geography of the policymakers' landscape. And we know it very little. Well, I'm kind of, by my residence in Washington, D.C. and working at the Smithsonian, am familiar with this map because we go to various interagency meetings. Many of you are not. And this is something that creates this kind of vision of a black box behind the fence into which we are supposed to throw something without knowing what is there. And the other thing that we learned from that being exposed on this landscape is that it is very important to let yourself known. So be visible, be accessible, be proactive when they ask you to speak. You know, I once got an invitation to speak at the Navy organized workshop on the sea ice diminishing Arctic. And I went into the room full of, you know, white Navy uniformed people in some undisclosed underground location in downtown Washington, D.C. And I found it extremely rewarding and very, very intellectually stimulating. And evidently they did as well, because they invited me 5 times more to come and give them talks about Arctic indigenous people. If I were in my usual mood of why should I go there? Why should I know them? They have little relevance to what I'm doing. I would have never been exposed to this, but they would have never been exposed to what I told them. So my point is that, again, beyond the buzzwords, and we are scientists, there are certain practical things we can do and certain practical skills, not only talking in simple words, not only writing in short sentences, but also like being available, being exposed, being always open to a new invitation or a new speaking engagement or a new meeting, even though maybe the net outcome is 10%, it's still worth doing.
Emla. Yes. Please.
Well, I wanted to speak to what John was saying before about the competition that researchers have in groups trying to get their point across, for instance, in lobbyism, right? I mean, we don't have that same system in Iceland. Of course, people lobby people, and in fact, it may be easier because we're a very small country, so you just pick up the phone and you call the minister, basically. So in the end, it becomes a competition. And then, of course, if you're trying to reach the public, it becomes a competition on social media where you're competing with Nike, you know, or some other brand of goods that people really want to get their hands on and have an interest, or there is some sort of celebrity story that's going viral on Facebook, and a lot of competition. So I think the responsibility, because we're discussing responsibility to the public, I guess that also manifests in trying to get the research exactly where it needs to be, which is what you were saying. I just wanted to sort of support that point. In my work with the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, which is in Iceland, it's a very small ministry. It's not a lot of people, and you have those there that are kind of should be somewhere else by now, and then you have the ones that.
Remember, you're being recorded.
Yeah, I was trying to be diplomatic. It's not my strongest suit. But then you have also people that are very committed to what they're doing, you know, and they believe in what they're doing. They just don't have time to do everything. And with the proliferation of Arctic conferences and seminars and documents that are being circulated in the Arctic, there is no way, even if you're working in the Arctic 100%, you're not doing research, you're just sort of trying to figure out what's going on where, there is no way to monitor all that. And the research, because we can share it so easily, it's coming from all directions. So the question becomes, really, and I know it's distasteful, you know, it leaves a bad taste in your mouth, but you do have to be strategic about how you want to get from A to B to C towards the person that really has any kind of power to make a decision. The way we sometimes do it is to invite said person to come and visit us. In Iceland that works because it's a small country. You just invite them. They they travel for 45 minutes because we're in Akureyri, we give them a cup of coffee and some cake, you know, and then they are, you know, they can sit down and be and just sort of sit there for 5 or 10 minutes. I mean, if you try to approach them at a cocktail party, they're sort of buzzing and all over the place, and everyone is trying to hang on to their jacket and get their face in their face and push their name card, you know, their business cards onto them. So it's a frantic situation. It's a little bit like a meat market, in my view. It's just a little bit crazy. So it's a question of getting them when they're relaxed and focused. And the only way to do that is get some sort of alone time with them. And basically tell them, I'm going to tell you something very important. Please listen. That's the only way. But what you're fighting is groups that specialize in doing this. So it's very intimidating when you just want to be doing your work, you know, and you just want to be trying to create information that somebody can use for some sort of good, and then you have to go and sort of sell yourself like you're trying to sell yourself to a corporate law firm, and it just feels horrible, right? I mean, you just feel kind of double-faced. But I agree. I mean, we tend to create these boxes. Policymakers is one box. And they often become they, you know, without trying to figure out what is this they, you know. Is it a big bunch of people that just control everything, you know, and we don't really know who they are? Or is it this specific person? And now I'm rambling.
No, please keep going.
I could ramble on for a very long time, but I'm going to stop there. I think this is a very important part. It's defining exactly where it needs to go. Sometimes you feel like, when I started the project that we're in, the network, I felt enormous pressure to just be on Facebook. That seemed to be it, you know. And we didn't exist, even if with the work that we're doing, we don't exist unless we're on the web, on Facebook. And I'm not really a Facebook person, you know. It doesn't feel natural to me. I'm of that generation. I'm kind of private. I don't want to put all my stuff out there, you know. It just doesn't feel very well. But that's something that you have to do.
Yeah.
You know, so you may have to do something that is distasteful, but if you want to get the information across, you're just going to have to do it.
Emil, I think you bring up some really good points there, and then I think we need to get some coffee just so we can continue to be caffeinated and up. But it's really important, I think, to think about the fact that as we talk about the Arctic and we're looking at nations and smaller communities, but entire nations that have a governmental apparatus smaller than some of the smallest bureaucracies here in the United States, and understanding the cultures through which decisions are made in those places, whether we're talking about Iceland or Finland or Greenland, or whether we're talking about a regional community. I think we have a tendency, perhaps through a lot of our legislative approaches, to bombard people with massive amounts of information that make it impossible to respond to. And knowing that there is this very civilized concept of being able to sit down over coffee and cakes, only 10 drops, but you know, to be able to go there and to talk about things directly in these societies, in these cultures, is not only the only way you're going to get the work done, but it's also respectful within the community, because you're not sort of saying, I want to take up 3 weeks of your time to answer one question because I've sent you 2,000 pages of briefing documents. So I think that's really important. Speaking of 10 drops of coffee or a few more, should we go and grab some coffee and meet back here in about 15 minutes? Sorry? Oh, Jarkko. Please. Well, non-Americans can talk after coffee, too.
I can talk after coffee as well. So it doesn't, I don't want to stop
Jarkko.
people. I can see the faces here. But, well, you're lucky. I'm a Finn and we don't talk long. So I don't want to give you too much details on the Finnish academic policy and policy makers, but general comments. We are increasingly, highly sensitive nowadays to this increasing discussion about policy relevance. The one key issue is that 10 years ago, when one would have traveled to Brussels, a Finn would say that I'm going to Europe. Nowadays, we are considering that we are in Europe, part of the Europe, and we have kind of a included the European Union mind what comes to the funding via programs, earmarked money. So we have an increasing amount of Academic Finland's resources earmarked to certain kind of research which should be policy relevance. So that makes us a bit of a sensitive what comes to these policy relevance issues. So I have a rather general comment to this responsibility matter. This does not characterize any way to my own research. But I think that our first priority or responsibility is to do good quality research. That's the key issue, and I think that has been highlighted by others. Without that, we cannot do much other things. So that's kind of a first round issue. If we want to influence the policy, if our understanding of those issues is not academically sound, the policies that we are going to make, or the policymakers in their black box are going to do, won't be sound either. So that's the first kind of layer of core issue. But there needs to be a balance between these discussions, and I think we are going still increasingly in our, let's say, northern Finland, Scandinavia, to these more and more policy relevant matters. Hopefully it will balance back, but as this shouldn't be a zero-sum game, that either you do blue sky research or you serve the public or the policymakers. But there is one highly common issue what I was hearing here in between, let's say, Sweden, Finland, USA, that if you are located in DC, you have much more influence to policymaker than if you located somewhere else, I suppose. That the same goes with us. If you are in Oulu or if you are in Umeå, your access to Stockholm and those circles, or your access to Helsinki and those circles is rather minimal. So that relates to Akureyri case, that if you don't have access to them, you need to get them to you somehow. But that's of course another art. But that I think is my views, and I'm used, the time to coffee.
You're welcome to have more time, but I think actually you have absolutely provided the perfect segue, as I knew you would, to question C, to think about whether research priorities should be guided by national policy goals or be independent of them and focused on solid research. So let's go out, stretch our legs, take a breath of air, get some coffee, get something to eat, come back and talk about that.